Okay, let's move on now in terms of the physiology of heat transfer in babies. And no talk on thermoregulation would be complete without talking about the four mechanisms of heat transfer. I think we all learned it in medical school and nursing school and in high school, and these are important to recognize as they exist in babies as well as everybody else. So let's go over them briefly. Evaporation is the loss of water from the skin and water. The act of evaporation will allow heat to be removed from the body, very important. Conduction is how we are in contact with the bedding and things close to us. Anything in contact with the baby's skin will transfer heat either back or forth. So warm bedding could transfer heat to the baby, and cold bedding could remove it. Convection is, as we talked about before, the impact of air moving over the baby, and so that could, if it's warm air, you can warm the baby that way. If it's cold air, you remove air. And radiation, remove temperature. And radiation is sort of this magical transfer of energy from, in many cases, the sun or warm source at the speed of light to the baby's skin. So you can radiate to the baby and heat the baby, or you can lose through radiation from the baby to another object. And so we're in contact with everything in the room, and everything in the room will impact. So as I stand here today, the humidity impacts my thermoregulation. What I'm touching, this board, if it's cold, could remove some heat from me. If air blows by me, I will cool, and certainly we know that from a windy day. And I'm impacted by the light. I'm also impacted by anything in the room. The doors, the walls, the screen are radiating back and forth from and to me. Concentrating on one of the more difficult challenges in the baby, and that is water, the water loss and the water gains of the baby. And this is perhaps one of the most challenging things that happens, and another area that we really became much more expert in preterm babies management. And there are two real large areas of water loss. There is urine and other areas that we won't talk about, but there's the areas that we're most concerned about, and for heat regulation is loss from the skin, transepidermal water loss, and loss from lungs or respiratory water loss. Both can be extreme in preterm babies. And the effect of the water loss is impacted markedly by the humidity. So we know that, for instance, on ventilation, if you humidify the gases going to a baby, that will markedly change the amount of water loss from the lungs. And we learned in the 80s and 90s that we could actually heat the gases in the ventilator tubing with a wire going down the tubing so that you maintain the humidity, and that would prevent drying out of the airways and also prevent some water loss. So we spent a great deal of time, and respiratory therapists certainly spent a great deal of time, keeping the baby's air warmed and humidified that's going in through a ventilator tubing, and so too when we have a baby breathing air, whether it be room air or supplemental oxygen, we want to keep that humidified as well. And if you look at this slide where it talks about the amount of water carried by the air versus the air temperature, you can see dramatic changes. So if I'm in this environment today now with a certain amount of water vapor and I warm it up, the water content, the relative humidity will drastically change. So while as the water content may stay the same, the relative humidity will drop. So if you look at this slide, a baby sitting at a temperature of 68 degrees or near room temperature who may have an ambient water vapor pressure of 20 millimeters of mercury, if you then warm that to 40 degrees, that will go from a relative humidity of 50% down to a relative humidity of less than 20% just by warming. So as you warm the incubator and you warm the temperature, if you're just using ambient air vapor pressure, that air will get drier and drier. And the point is that you can both add a lot of moisture when you warm the baby. You could pump in a lot more water and surround the baby with a lot more water when you warm them. And likewise, if you don't pump in water, you will dry them out much more quickly in a warm environment. Certainly we know that from personal experience. If you go to the beach on a hot day, even with the relative humidity being, with the water vapor pressure being relatively high, you'll dry out. Versus a cold environment, which takes much less water vapor pressure to have the humidity be high. In addition to this factor of warmth on water vapor pressure that's surrounding the baby, we have the factor of how quickly the skin will lose water. So a preterm baby, particularly a new preterm baby, will have skin that's really very transparent, as was the case of baby Elle, and will lose water quickly and easily because they don't have this keratin layer on their skin. It takes some time, a week or two, for the preterm to start to develop this layer that will prevent water loss. And in a very, very preterm baby, 23, 24 weeks, you'll see water beading up on the skin because it's so transparent that there's basically almost no barrier. So it's important to recognize that as a preterm baby is born, they are both preterm and young. And so as they age, even in days, their skin losses will change based purely on the physiology and the physiology and the growth of the barrier of the skin. Now, adults in particular have other mechanisms of water loss, and obviously sweating is one of them. So when we get too hot, we will sweat, we'll lose water, and that will be one of our heat transfer mechanisms. Babies don't have sweat glands, and so they can't sweat. And this factor, although it saves them a little bit in terms of water loss, also prevents them from adapting to thermal environments. So what's the consequences of a high transepidermal thermal water loss in a preterm infant? As they lose water from their skin in a low humidified environment, lots of things can change. So they can lose temperature, they become hypothermic quickly because, as we talked in the beginning, water loss is a factor in terms of maintaining the body temperature. And importantly, they will lose not only water, but they'll lose the electrolytes will be altered. As you lose free water and sweating, the salt, which may have been normal 1 minute, will start to increase in concentration as you lose water, as you become dehydrated. So it really complicates the management. The water losses will change the management of the baby. When we first introduced humidity in our nursery a little over a decade ago, we had marked challenges of changing the amount of fluids we would give the babies, and we had to monitor the sodium content until we got used to it. And basically what it meant was we could reduce the amount of fluid we gave the baby once we humidified them. And actually the amount of reduction was really quite dramatic, which spoke to the value of humidity in terms of management. Not only was it easier to manage because you use less fluid, but they were much more stable, and they were able to help us manage their own sodium better. So ways of controlling this water loss, particularly from the skin, have been out there for years, and they're really of two types. One is trying to put some waterproof covering on the baby, whether it just be a blanket of some sort or a barrier, a skin barrier, some sort of cream or ointment, or even a plastic coating that sticks on the baby. All these have been tried, and more recently, probably more accepted in most nurseries, is just humidification of the air itself. And as incubator technology has improved, so too has our ability to safely humidify the gas that the baby is exposed to. So all this is impacted by this particular slide, which is talking about the transepithelial water loss in the preterm infant relative to the relative humidity. So as the humidity goes up, you have less and less water loss in all babies, but this is impacted much more significantly on the very preterm infant. So in the 24 to 26 week infant, there's huge amounts of water loss at low relative humidities. So much water loss that it's very difficult to control their fluid balance. And this is variable minute to minute and also on the babies themselves. And that changes dramatically and narrows as the baby becomes more, as the environment becomes more humidified. So as we move closer and closer to 100% humidity, they get to act more and more like a term baby in terms of their transepidermal water loss, and therefore it allows for more control. Part of the control of the thermal environment includes humidity. Humidity is an incredibly important part of this whole package. As your humidity goes up, you'll need less temperature. The way the humidity impacts on the skin and the respiratory system is important. And so humidity, the addition or subtraction of humidity can really affect this tool in the management of the baby. One of the things that we like to do in preterm babies is to add humidity because there's a great deal of water loss from the skin and from the respiratory system in preterm babies especially as they're younger. So as we add humidity, we find more stability in terms of the vital signs, in terms of their sodium and water content, and it makes it much easier for us to manage the babies. So one of the factors just summarized in this slide is that when an incubator air temperature is between 33 and 39 degrees, the humidity can change dramatically from 20 to 50% just by changing the temperature. So at these levels, when the temperature is high, transepidermal water loss can be exceptionally high. You'd want to have a higher relative humidity. So it's important to consider humidification whenever you incubate a baby, particularly a preterm baby, because of the need of to heat the baby. Unless you're adding humidity, you're naturally going to dramatically increase their epithelial water loss. And as depicted in this slide, as the babies are managed without humidity, the skin water loss, again, very dramatically increased in this particular baby L, the 28-week gestation preterm baby, until the baby gets to be 2 to 3 weeks. So our protocol at Jefferson is to add humidity until the baby gets to be 2 to 3 weeks of age, and then you could treat them more like a term baby. And we won't humidify the incubator for a term baby that may need to be warmed. In the nursery, temperature is a vital sign, and we look at it as such in our nursery. So when we do rounds, when we talk to the nurses, we talk about where's the incubator in terms of its temperature, is it on servo control, is it on skin control? It is a part of the discussion. And what that does is it brings us back to this as a vital sign. This is a technology that's important to consider. And as we talk to our nurses, we talk about weaning, we talk about how the baby is doing in the incubator, whether it's time to start weaning, whether they're showing signs of cold stress or heat stress. And all this is part of the regular routine evaluation of babies. One of the things that we've done, for instance, is we've come up with protocols that have been that attention has been paid to in terms of evidence and in terms of their approach to incubation. And so we've talked about humidity and how we're going to approach preterm babies, when we're going to use that, and we've talked about weaning parameters in our babies, and that's important to do in any intensive care nursery.